heroespatriots.org, where you can read about the people that have been on our program in the recent years and months. And all of our shows are able to be linked to program archives through our website. So, again, that's heroespatriots.org. And as John said, we have found a wonderful home here at KMUD, and we couldn't be happier. So I want to let you know that you can listen to our program, Heroes and Patriots. We're filling in today, the first and fifth Thursdays of each month. Our next show will be September 2nd. It runs from 9 a.m. live. You have the opportunity to call in and speak to our guests, just like we offered with Danny Scherson. And so I would encourage you to check that out and call in. We love to have community participation. Dennis, I'm not sure if we have our next guest on the phone, but we will be talking to Sam Husseini. Sam is a good friend of John's, and he is an independent journalist now writing at Substack. He has questioned numerous U.S. officials who have refused to acknowledge Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal. And John, his most recent article, Why Won't Biden and Others Admit Israel Has Nuclear Weapons? And so I wondered, Dennis, if we had Sam on the phone.
I'm
having trouble connecting. Need a minute. Okay. So
well, I can do a little background on this really disturbing issue, Mary, if you will. By the way, Mary and I are not sitting next to each other as we usually are when we do the program. I am literally on the other side of the world. So I want to thank Mary for psychically picking up my cues as to when to jump in or let Mary jump in. So, Mary, thank you for being telepathically connected to me. And I also want to thank Dennis for hosting the program, engineering the program as well. Our next segment is going to be on Israel's secret nuclear arsenal, 400 nukes. Why is it such a secret? And, you know, this is not an academic question. You know, as Afghanistan falls today, as we see the chaos at the Kabul airport, as we look at the failure of U.S. policy in the Middle East, and I mean a total failure. Iraq was a failure. Afghanistan is a failure. Pakistan will be a failure. Our policies in Iran, our attitudes towards them are deeply troubling as well. We should have gone off to Saudi Arabia instead of Afghanistan, as Michael Moore pointed out last night, because the 9/11 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. They weren't from Afghanistan. They weren't from Iraq. But
hey, John, Sam is with us. If you'd like to say hello and welcome him to the program.
Sam, are you there?
Howdy. How are you guys?
Hey, brother.
Hey,
welcome to KMUD Radio in Northern California.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
So let's kick it off, Sam.
John was just
the Institute for Research of Middle East Policy actually had to sue to challenge the secrecy of gag order WNP 136 that forbid all U.S. government from discussing Israel's nuclear programs. And this followed James Doyle's article that was published, Why Eliminate Nuclear Weapons, which had been cleared by security by his employer and published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, but yet he was slammed down for it, and the secrecy gag went into effect. Why the secrecy for Israel's nuclear arsenal of between 300 and 400 nuclear warheads? Why?
Well, it's not 100% known, but it seems to be because there's laws on the books, Glenn Symington amendments to Foreign Assistance Acts and other provisions that if you're a nuclear weapons proliferator, that is, if you're a country that either acquires nuclear weapons or helps another country get nuclear weapons, that you shouldn't get U.S. funding. And Israel has basically violated that twice over. It's got nuclear weapons illegally, I might add, by swiping technology and resources from facilities in the United States and elsewhere to get its own nuclear weapons arsenal, and it also tried to sell nuclear weapons to the apartheid regime in South Africa. That should, if you apply U.S. law, if the U.S. acknowledges that Israel has nuclear weapons, then presumably those laws would kick in, and the aid, over $3 billion a year that Israel's gotten. Grant Smith estimates it total over time to be approaching $300 billion with a B dollars that Israel's gotten. That's the proviso. There are ways they could get around it. If they do acknowledge Israel's nuclear weapons, then I think that the president would have to stipulate every 6 months that it's in the vital national security interest that this aid continues. Even if they do that, even if they do acknowledge it, there do seem to be ways that they could get around the law, but it seems that they don't want to do that. And now this has happened through administration after administration. It started under Nixon with sort of a verbal agreement that he had with Golda Meir, the then Israeli prime minister, and it just blossomed, and they actually have formal letters, apparently, where the U.S., at the beginning of every administration, apparently, we don't know about the Biden administration, but the New Yorker documented it with respect to prior administrations, that they actually give a letter to Israel at the beginning of the administration saying, we promise that we won't acknowledge your nuclear weapons. So it's an absurd situation, and it just shows what a farce U.S. policy is, that it can't acknowledge the empirical reality of a massive nuclear weapons arsenal.
Right.
And meanwhile, you have administrations running around, not just Bush. I mean, Bush was the worst, but, you had the Clinton administration running around and other administrations saying Iraq has nuclear weapons or has weapons of mass destruction and is acquiring nuclear weapons. And now, of course, it's shifted to Iran, perennially, 2 stitches away from acquiring nuclear weapons, and therefore we got to ramp up things with Iran. So it just, and they threaten Iran. That's what. Right.
And that was going to be my next question, Sam. In the context of what's happening in Afghanistan right now as we speak, with the collapse of Afghanistan and the total failure, total abject failure of U.S. policy in Afghanistan, as well as Iraq, what does Israel's nuclear arsenal mean in the context of these failures? In the context of former Secretary of State Colin Powell stating, and I quote, Israel has over 200 nuclear weapons pointed at Tehran. As the caliphate expands, I would think that the level of paranoia in Israel is going from DEFCON 5 to DEFCON 1. Your thoughts?
Well, I might take a little quibble with how you're framing things. First off, I don't know that U.S. policy in Afghanistan and Iraq is necessarily a failure. A lot of opportunistic and criminal people made a lot of money. In their eyes, it's probably not a failure. I know that's a very grim way.
That's a very cynical view, my friend.
No, it's not cynical. I'm not condemning human nature.
Right.
I'm condemning the individual criminals who we need to, expose and purge out of decision-making capacities in our, government and corporate life. So, I don't think that it necessarily, are failures. I'm not sure to what extent Israel actually feels, threatened. Again, they have a nuclear weapons monopoly in the region, unless you want to count the U.S. and Russia, and therefore they know that they ultimately, have this enormous weapon pointed at everybody's head. And I think that for all of the rhetoric that you might hear out of Tehran and other places, all of them ultimately know that they can't cross Israel too badly, or they are literally dust.
Sam, I wanted to ask
I don't know
briefly, if I might, about inspections. If there's no admission that Israel has any kind of nuclear weapons by the United States, how has there ever been any inspections of what they really have, given that everyone is up in arms when we're trying to inspect other countries, and when we can't, there's sanctions, etc. Where has that ever happened? And if so, who has inspected Israel's weapons?
No, there's never been a meaningful inspection over Israel's weapons, or at least I think that there was one inspection in the 1960s. I can't recall if it was the U.S. government inspectors or the IAEA. But basically, Israel created a fake wall in its main nuclear weapons facility, Dimona, and I don't know the details of it, but they set up a series of apparatuses to try to hide the fact that they had a nuclear weapons program. Exactly what they're always accusing Iran and company of doing.
Right, exactly.
I think over time the program just got too big and they couldn't hide it anymore, and then they just stopped even pretending to have inspections, and it's just this open secret. Everybody knows it, and nobody, the U.S. doesn't acknowledge it. And, even if you look at the UN meeting, they have these periodic meetings of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Israel hasn't signed, and they frequently end up in disarray because people eventually say, well, hold on, what about Israel? And then they, go through this long, argument over how to phrase the final communique of these UN meetings as to why they fell apart. And they'll, make some compromise, or they won't issue a statement at all, or they'll make a compromise that says something like, due to the status of another state that's not a signatory, these talks could not proceed productively. There is some vacuous statement like that. And what's really remarkable to me is, even if you get some Pepto-Bismol or caffeine or whatever you need to do to listen to the UN statements every fall, where they have the General Assembly and the U.S. president gets up there and talks. You're only supposed to talk for 15 minutes. The U.S. president always talks for an hour, and everybody else talks for 15 minutes. And then you have Iran and Syria and other countries, and even the so-called moderate, pro-U.S. Arab states like Qatar and others. They'll sort of, say it's complete diplomatic ease. They won't, just spell it out. They'll say this garbled diplomatic talk about how we need to approach disarmament obligations in the region comprehensively, and the Middle East should be a nuclear weapons free zone. But they won't just spell it out. They won't just say Israel has nuclear weapons. This is ridiculous.
Right.
The guy who exposed it, Mordecai Vanunu, has been suffered in solitary confinement for 18 god-awful years, and he's currently under house arrest in Jerusalem. And let's stop this insane farce, and let's start getting serious about disarmament and bringing peace to the Middle East. And we can't do that if we have this massive elephant in the room that nobody's acknowledging.
Sam, in the previous segment on this show today, we were talking with our friend Matt Ho and Danny Sorensen, your friend as well, by the way, about the failure in Afghanistan. And we're talking about secrets and lies, how so much was lied about how America deluded itself about so much, how so much was the failure and the deteriorating situation in Afghanistan was secret, how the public corruption, a lot of it was secret. None of this makes it to the mainstream media. But yet here, in talking about Israel, we have the same scenario playing out. And I'll list it under the heading of secrets and lies. Not only is Israel's nuclear arsenal a secret, but the U.S. Is diverting materials and technologies to Israel, as it did with past nuclear triggers, weapons-grade uranium, nuclear development technologies. They've been diverting that as well. And in fact, another big secret is the $300 billion in foreign aid we've given to Israel since 1949. Again, all off the books, all off the secret, all secret, or if not secret, all lied about. Just comment on just how much is secret when it comes to Israel.
Yeah, well, I mean, the aid is, I think in large part, known. There might be some that comes out of the black budget. I'm sure, there's a hell of a lot of other stuff in the black budget. And I'm sure that there's a great deal of secrecy in terms of U.S. policy with Israel. Israel is almost always at the nexus of, secret aspects of U.S. foreign policy, whether it's Iran-Contra. They acted as a go-between in that scandal, which was a rare example of some stuff that was supposed to be secret coming out. But I mean, part of the problem seems to be that a lot of stuff is classified at such a high level. For example, if you looked at the Snowden documents, when they came out, there was very little on Israel.
Right. And
the suspicion is that that was probably classified at a higher level than what Snowden had access to. So we don't even know how secret stuff is. I alluded to earlier Israel apparently trying to sell nuclear weapons technology to the apartheid government of South Africa.
I was going to ask about that.
And this was under the Carter administration, mind you.
Right.
And they apparently bent over backwards to keep it all under wraps. And ultimately, for whatever reason, the sale apparently didn't go through. I don't know if the South African regime didn't want to or couldn't pony up enough money or what. Desmond Tutu, who of course was the Archbishop in South, I guess he still is an Archbishop. I mean, he's in retirement now, and he presided. Was a main organizer, of course, of the anti-apartheid struggle. And he presided over the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, after the apartheid regime to keep the country together. I mean, one of the most, central figures of the last 100 years. He actually had a piece that was published by The Guardian on New Year's Eve, before Biden got into office, urging Biden to break with this insane policy of not acknowledging that Israel's nuclear weapons exist. And part of what he, put out there was that, that you basically, that the fact that South Africa didn't get nuclear weapons might have been part of the reason that it ultimately was dismantled. That is why the apartheid system was dismantled.
Interesting.
Whereas when Israel, it hasn't, of course, been dismantled, and Tutu for years has been calling Israel an apartheid state. And in this piece, he said, it's the most horrific thing. You have an apartheid state with, nuclear weapons, and that obviously could be genocidal. And he says basically that, with Israel having nuclear weapons, that's basically preventing that system from being dismantled. So it really could be totally central to making progress in terms of the Middle East, and both in terms of the situation with the Palestinians, but more broadly, just bringing some semblance of sanity to U.S. policy in the Middle East, and hopefully with some serious.
You're listening to Monday Morning Magazine. It's Monday, August 16th, 20 minutes past the hour, and our guest today is Sam Husseini, and we are talking about the secret of nuclear weapons in Israel. Sam, I wondered if we know the cat is out of the bag, it's not a secret. What types of weapons, nuclear weapons, has and is Israel developing?
That's a great question. I don't know if they've developed things like neutron bombs and so on. I think it's established that they have a hydrogen bomb as well as atomic bombs, but I don't know. I know that they had tactical nuclear weapons as well that they put on the Golan Heights, so that if they were to lose the Golan Heights, and this is particularly reckless because it could almost accidentally trigger a nuclear war,
right?
Because if Syria, it would be a rather miraculous thing for Syria to have done, to somehow grab Israel, got hold of the Golan Heights in the course of the 1960s.